When Lewis Hamilton was penalised for doing 2 practice starts out of position on his way to the grid at the Russian Grand Prix, my first reaction was, seems fair enough, he's broken the rules. There were some slightly complicated circumstances around things like the wording of the race director's event notes and whose responsibility was it? Was it Lewis's or was it the team? But I found it difficult to argue with the outcome that the stewards had come to. Since then though, some more information's come to light. Now, many of you will know this by now. In fact, many of you sent it to me to draw it to my attention, so thank you. But at the Belgian Grand Prix, just a few races ago, Charles Leclerc and his Ferrari performed a practice start out of position on his way to the grid, outside of the designated area which was prescribed in the race director's event notes. Sound familiar? Here's how it went down. Now, in Belgium, just like in Russia, the race director issues his event notes ahead of the weekend, and down here in section 18 he outlines exactly when and where practice starts can take place. Even more specifically in this document, he says these must be done prior to the safety car 2 line. And to make sure there's absolutely no ambiguity, he even included a photograph to make sure that everybody was well aware of the exact location that practice starts should take place. So how can it be then that at the Belgian Grand Prix, old Charlie boy was investigated by the stewards for doing a slower than permitted reconnaissance lap to the grid, and yet Ferrari's defence was, well, hang on, the reason that lap was slow was because he actually crossed the safety car 2 line, triggering the timing beacon, stopped and did a practice start, hence the lap looked a lot slower than it was. And the stewards turned around and said, oh yeah, that makes sense, absolutely. And yet seemingly glossing over the fact that Charlie boy had clearly broken another one of the race director's pre-event notes. Because ultimately, that's the problem, isn't it? Because all anybody wants, whether you are a member of a team, whether you're a fan of a particular driver, even if you are a driver, all that really matters to you, whether or not you agree with the decision, is that we have consistency. And I'll pick this up after I've finished my lunch. So, consistency. There it is. Not that one, but this one. Consistent behaviour or treatment. And a lot of you have been in touch with me recently, and I mean a lot of you, to talk about how the inconsistent treatment of certain drivers or the inconsistent behaviour of the FIA or the race stewards is somehow proof of an inherent bias against a particular driver or team, or for a particular driver or team. In this particular case, many of you think this is just another instance that backs up the theory that the FIA somehow is on the side of Ferrari and has always been and will always be there to give them a little helping hand on their way back towards success. Now, although there are and have been a number of questionable decisions which may appear to favour Ferrari over the years, I'm not one of these people that buys into that theory. I don't believe the FIA are in any way biased towards Ferrari. However, what it does do is raise another very important, perhaps even more important issue in all of this. Now look, I'm a parent of multiple children. I've got loads of them. 4. But I'm sure many of you are too, parents of more than one child. And if you are, you'll know how important it is when you are the rule maker in your household or the enforcer of those rules within your household to be fair and consistent in your application of those rules. So if you've got one child that breaks the rules and another child that does a similar kind of thing a week or 2 later, it's really important to be seen as being fair between the two. Otherwise you open yourself up to all sorts of problems. And that's no different, is it, when it comes to governing or running the rules of a certain sport like Formula 1. You have to be seen to be being fair, because when you do that you open up a level playing field. And in sport, you know the rules that you're playing to, you know if you break those rules that you're going to get a consistent punishment. If you know what that is, you can then take on the risk of breaching those rules if you deem it worthy. You can push the limits knowing what the consequences will be, because it's going to be consistently applied on every occasion and with every driver. We need to swap those two around, don't we?
Oh, I think we meant to put them down here.
Dad, no.
So you got that?
Yeah. I'm really struggling on this question. It's 93,475 times 17.
Bringing it back to the kids, imagine if you were to treat one of your children differently to the other. Imagine if you were to be a lot more lenient with one than the other. Now for one of those that's going to be great, but for the other one they're going to look on and see you treating the other child differently, and of course that's going to have a huge emotional impact on them. They're going to feel unloved, they're going to feel like the world is an unfair place. You know, crazy though it sounds, I even feel like I have to be overly consistent when it comes to the dogs, because if I'm walking past one in the house and I stop to give him a little tickle under the chin, I feel like I've got to go and then do it to the other one, because otherwise it'll be sit there looking up at me thinking, well hang on a minute, you just gave him a tickle under the chin, why aren't you giving me one? It's mad, I know. Hey darling,
yeah?
Do you think we're consistent parents?
Only with Rex.
The knock-on effects of all that can be quite severe, because you can have a breakdown in trust. Your child may never end up trusting you properly because they don't feel like they're getting fair treatment. And that's no different when it comes to sport, is it? And that's where the real problem is here, because whether or not the FIA or Formula One or the race stewards or anybody else actually have an inherent bias towards a particular driver or team, the fact that millions of fans watching this sport, the fact that hundreds, if not thousands of people even within the sport might be thinking that, might be having those kind of thoughts running around their head, well that's a huge problem, because the perception of bias is almost as big as there actually being biases in the first place. When it comes to handing out punishments and penalties, there is always going to be a certain level of inconsistency, because these are humans making these choices, making these decisions. And sometimes there are factors around these incidents, sometimes seemingly very small and insignificant, but that could actually have an impact on a certain day with a certain person and a certain incident on a certain racetrack in certain weather conditions at a certain event, and so many other individual certainties that can make a difference in these things. So we have to accept that we're not always going to get it. It's not always going to be black and white. There is going to be some ambiguity. But you know, that's sport. And it's what gets people talking. It's what generates some interest and some passion around some of these things. What we absolutely cannot have is a perception that there is a bias within the sport. Because sport can't be sport if it's not fair. There are so many things and criticisms we can throw at this sport when it comes to having a level playing field. The very last thing we should be doing is opening ourselves up to people being able to throw some criticism of stewarding bias, rule-making bias towards certain teams. When it comes to my kids, there will be days when one of my kids gets punished for something that maybe 2 years ago my other kid didn't get punished for a similar offence. It's going to happen. But what I will always do is go out of my way to make sure there is absolutely no way any one of my 4 children could possibly think that there is an inherent bias in me towards one of the others. I do that through being open, through being honest, through explaining some of my decisions to them, so that they can try and understand that maybe 2 years ago there was perhaps some slightly different set of circumstances that made me think differently. Perhaps my thinking has just moved on in that time. And that's why we can't compare decisions in Formula One today to a decision that maybe happened at a racetrack 3 years ago, because the thinking around stewarding, around enforcing rules, does move on. But we can absolutely compare a decision that happens today to one that happened 3 races ago. So you cannot apply a rule very strictly, as was the case with Lewis Hamilton in Russia, and yet not apply that same rule in the same level of strictness to a driver just 3 races ago in Belgium with Charles Leclerc. Now I actually believe that in that instance it was probably a case of the FIA or the stewards not really realising that he'd broken that particular rule, because they were so focused on the other rule that they were actually investigating. That's my honest feeling. It was probably something like that. The truth is that none of us really picked up on the fact until much, much later, after the Russian Grand Prix, that he'd broken that rule of stepping beyond the safety car 2 line to do his practice start. So perhaps it's forgivable that the stewards missed that or forgot about it. But if they did, maybe they should come and explain that. Maybe should own up and say, I'm afraid we got that one wrong. We didn't realise it at the time. We slipped up. It's okay to admit you have made a mistake. And actually, in this kind of instance, it's far better to do that because it helps to alleviate that feeling of bias that some of the fans, lots of the fans, are really starting to build up a picture of themselves without having the evidence to dispel those myths. If we accept that we will never have a fully bulletproof, 100% consistent system to adjudicate on the incidents in a Formula One Grand Prix, we need to have the next best thing. And that needs to be something that's open, that's honest, that's transparent with the people watching, the fans, and the people taking part, the drivers and teams. But also we need to give ourselves the best shot at being consistent. If you just look at the two incidents, the Hamilton incident and the Leclerc incident, we've got 4 completely different stewards in that room making that decision. We have the same people driving the cars, we have the same people running the teams, we have the same people in race control. Why not have the same people in the stewards room? And why not give them a little bit more responsibility rather than just being amateur volunteers that sometimes pop in at the last minute? It seems very amateur for a sport that's so professional, so big, and has so much riding on it. So whilst we all need to give a little bit of leeway towards the stewards, instead of being so harsh and so critical, we've got to allow them to do their job and accept that at times they have a very, very difficult job. They won't always get it right. But in return, we should expect from them to admit, to accept when they have made mistakes, to be able to revisit things, to be able to give themselves a little bit more leeway to apply common sense to certain things as long as they can do it in a consistent manner. That's all we want, and it's all Formula One needs.